In this video, I'm going to break down what entrepreneurial stress drivers are and how they negatively affect your productivity, your delegation, and ultimately your fulfillment as a business owner. I'm going to show you the 7 dimensions of entrepreneurial stress and the 64 drivers that I assess for whenever I work with my entrepreneurial clients. And in addition to that, I'm going to show you how these stress drivers often manifest as profit and time leaks, which are oftentimes the root cause of any revenue or growth plateaus that I see with the business client owners that I work with. And finally, I'm going to show you how to turn these stresses into what I call kid-like enthusiasm, and in turn take that as fuel to transform all those profit and time leaks into more peaceful, joyous profits that ultimately fund the ideal life that you want to live. Here we are, starting with what entrepreneurial stresses are. Entrepreneurial stress drivers are patterns of thought, patterns of feeling, and patterns of behavior that ultimately drive stress in both the business owner themselves and in the business itself. Okay, so it affects both the owner and it affects both the business. So as a quick example, if you have something like a pattern of an inner critic, okay, this is a very stressful pattern because there's constantly an inner critic judging everything that you do. Okay, so the thoughts that you're experiencing, the feelings that you're having, that's all going to drive stress for you internally. But externally, that's going to create very negative consequences within the business. You just have to look one step further to see how they ripple out more on an indirect basis, right? So let's just say that same inner critic pattern, those feelings and those thoughts of the inner critic, they drive you to hesitate to not call out underperforming team members. So that hesitation is a behavior, right? Because if I did the behavior that I actually wanted to say, that would be a behavior of speaking out, whereas the hesitation is the behavior of just keeping the peace, for lack of a better term, okay? That behavior has very real consequences inside of the business, right? Because now you're going to be paying for underperformance, which means it's going to affect your margins and ultimately your profits, because you have to compensate for that poorly done work. Okay, that's going to create more work for you. So it's actually now creating consequence in terms of how much you're getting paid on a per hour basis. Okay, if that spirals into unsatisfied clients, that's obviously going to create more stressful fires for you to put out. So ultimately, all of these things affect the bottom line, affect your profitability. Okay, but they all stem from a stress driver of an inner critic, right? Again, both the thought, the feeling, and the behavior ripple out to inner effects and external effects within the business, okay? So all entrepreneurial stress drivers are really going to negatively affect 3 categories of you as a business owner that are going to be most relevant to you. So number 1 is fulfillment, number 2 is productivity, and then number 3 is delegation. And this is essentially how they break down. So the fulfillment piece is obviously like your own sense of inner peace, right? It's pretty simple here. The more stressed out you are, the less fulfillment you're going to feel, the less joy you're going to have in the work that you're doing, the less peace and presence you're going to have outside of work because your work is so stressful. So any semblance of that sense of fulfillment is going to be very much drained by these entrepreneurial stress drivers, okay? Second one, okay, productivity. The more stressed out you are, the less productive you are in general. It's going to be harder to get things done, and it's going to be harder to get the right things done if so much of your mental real estate is being utilized to deal and cope with whatever the stress driver consequences are. So whether if it's just internal, like I just have a lot of stressful thoughts and the feelings inside, like I don't know how to cope with, that's obviously going to impact your ability to get the right things done and to get more things done. And then if it ripples out to the actual business in terms of, well, now I've delayed this, so now there's some consequences there, etc. Like all of that is going to create a lot of issues in terms of your overall output. And then obviously delegation. So this is one of the biggest areas where business owners have the most issues in terms of managing people and specifically creating the leverage around them. So if all of your feelings and your thoughts and behaviors that are driven by these stress patterns pass down to your employees, either as inefficiencies or as hesitations or as just like bad communication, all of that then ripples out to compound into, again, all those compensations we talked about previously in the video, right? So overall, that's how you want to think about what entrepreneurial stress drivers are and how they negatively impact your fulfillment, your productivity, and your delegation. And in general, when I'm working with clients, I'm assessing for 7 core dimensions of these stress drivers, okay? And they generally going to impact, like I said, the fulfillment, the productivity, and the delegation. And I assess for 64 individual stress drivers that basically fall into 7 core dimensions, right? So dimension number 1 is problematic habits. So this is where you'll find stress drivers around like procrastination, avoidance, addiction type patterns, like addicted to your phone, or like gotta have a drink at the end of every single day because it's so stressful. Okay, all of that's going to impact, again, your fulfillment, your delegation, and your productivity. Second dimension is interpersonal and team. So this is where you'll find the stress driver patterns that include things like people pleasing and a lack of boundaries, control, right? So this is the second portion of the team. And this is basically anything to do with delegation where you can't let go, right? So I have like trust issues. I'm doing tasks that I shouldn't be doing. I'm micromanaging things. Like all of that's going to fall into that category. Visibility is number 4. So this is the stress driver that's essentially all around shrinking your expertise, how good you are, how bold you are, how much space you want to take up into the world. So anything that really has to do with getting attention to yourself, especially in the way of growing your business, is going to be negatively affected by the stress drivers in this dimensions. Number 5 is going to be fear. Okay, so this is the stress driver that basically powers things where you tend to spiral into anxiety, into doubts. Okay, and that's a lot of hesitation and a lack of pulling the trigger on things and making decisions are going to go into this category. The next one is self-talk. Okay, so this is what we talked about with the inner critic would fall into this category, but also things like imposter syndrome, things like analysis paralysis. It's just like I keep having to ruminate and think things through that I'm thinking I'm not basically good enough. Okay, so all of that's going to create a whole lot of hesitation where you just can't move and are stalling progress because of it. And then lastly, the 7th dimension is emotional overload. So this is any patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior that essentially keep you overwhelmed or create more of those perpetual chronic negative feelings. So other ones could be like guilt over too much working, like I'm not spending time with my family. There's a lot of guilt there, like ever present. Or on the flip side, taking time off. Like even when I'm on vacation, I'm still stressed out and I feel guilty. Okay, that's all in the dimension of emotional overload. Okay, so I actually assess for all of these in my Peaceful Profits roadmap. So if you want to check that out, you can see the links somewhere in and around the video for this. And if you want to check out my Joyous Profits live coaching podcast, I essentially take people that are business owners that want to assess this for themselves. I record the coaching call as a result of that and post it as my podcast. So you can check that out as well. Anyway, getting back to the core thing here. So the issue that is the biggest one here as far as the stress drivers are concerned isn't that they just make you feel bad and put you in a crappy state. That's obviously, big enough depending on how much of this happens for you. But they also impact the business, and more specifically what we've talked about so far in the area of profit and time leaks. Okay. Most of the time when I have business owners that come to me that have some sort of growth plateau, whether that's can't get over a revenue milestone, can't get over a profit milestone, feast and famine type things, like anywhere it's like I'm always trying to hit over this point but can never seem to work. Generally, the idea here is not to do more, because more is probably means you're just compensating for these profit and time leaks that are created by these entrepreneurial stress drivers. The point is you want to flip that, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the video, of if you plug those profit and time leaks, suddenly all of your efforts are useful, they create leverage, they basically create more peaceful, joyous profits, because it's exhausting to keep trying to fill a leaky bucket. Okay, so basically the way you want to look at this is you're generally going to be leaking profit from these entrepreneurial stress drivers in one of 2 ways. So directly, so for example, if you are paying someone and they are underperforming, that is essentially a direct profit leak, because their underperformance is creating a lack of result that you needed in order to ensure the margins were good for what it is that you delivered. So in a very real sense, if this thing was supposed to take 3 hours for this employee to do, but you paid them for 5, you are literally leaking 2 hours of profit, so whatever that amounts to for that particular employee, because of that inefficiency. Okay, so that is a direct profit leak in terms of, let's just say, underperformance in this instance. And if that's caused by a stress driver of you having people-pleasing tendencies, that's actually the root of it. Like it starts from the top and trickles down into a real-world business consequence. Okay, the other aspect of this is the time. So it's not only the time of the employee that is basically calculated out as profit leak inefficiencies, but it is actually your time as well, which oftentimes business owners that I work with will overlook. So if you are having to go in there and compensate for that underperformance, okay, that in turn is taking time away from you, from the things that you actually enjoy doing. And the reason you wanted the freedom of entrepreneurship is to do the things you want to do with the people you want to do them when you want to do them, okay, funded by the profits that actually fulfill you and fund your ideal life. That's ultimately what this whole thing is about. Again, back to it, right? So like you are leaking time to compensate for their underperformance. Okay, so if you're now flipping that, how much is your time worth? That is now, in terms of like hours and time that you are indirectly leaking, just looking at yourself. And then on an opportunity cost perspective, like zooming out of this, all of these profit and time leaks that you have to ultimately compensate for directly, indirectly, create a lack of internal space, so meaning mental real estate, for you to actively solve the big problems in your business and to actively go after the big needle movers that are going to put you into the next level, that is going to create the fulfillment and all the things that you ultimately envision. So basically, when it comes down to it, like, profit and time leaks are the most overlooked cause of growth plateaus, because it's going to take way more resources to compensate for these leaks and then get a new level of essentially freely available time and profit than it does to just plug the profit and time leaks that are already causing you stress to begin with. And then from that point, enact whatever operational changes need to be made to make this whole thing run better. Okay. So that brings us to this whole point of like, how do you transform all of these entrepreneurial stress drivers and the profit and time leaks that they cause into this kid-like enthusiasm? We're like, okay, we're like excited. Let's go do this. I'm so pumped to make this happen. And then turn that into what I call more peaceful, joyous profits that fund your ideal life. As I've alluded to already, number one, you eliminate the stress drivers at the root. And the root isn't operational. The root is always either in the identity and or the leadership of essentially yourself. Okay? Because I mentioned people pleasing a bunch of times here. So if your core stress driver is one of people pleasing, in that case, that is something that is a characteristic of your identity as it is right now, which is due to your history, the woundings you've had in your history, traumas can be put into this situation, how you grew up, like all of those things beyond the scope of this particular video. But this is what I assess for in my Peaceful Profits roadmap. Okay, and then leadership, which is how do you translate who you are and the vision that you have into utilizing your team effectively, speaking your truth, being able to communicate what you want, keeping people accountable, not fearing confrontation, having high standards, enacting those high standards, setting boundaries, refereeing boundaries, like all of that. This is just the people-pleasing dimension, is going to go into the leadership aspect. Okay, so when you solve the stress driver at the root, you solve them at the level of identity and leadership. And then you can begin to assess and solve the actual operational issues that are like the consequence and the things you can see on the outside that need fixing. So for example, simple example here, it's, you know what, this SOP that we have it, but nobody follows it. Okay, so operationally, 90% of what needs to be done there is already done. The SOP is complete. When followed, it generates the result that you want. But the last 10% is lacking. Why? Because of the entrepreneurial stress driver of people pleasing, which means part of your identity is rooted into not wanting to keep people accountable. Part of your leadership is rooted in wanting to keep the peace and compensate, which is not a good leadership quality. Okay. That creates the 10% that's missing to operationally enact a change of, hey, we need an additional step where you tell me when this is done, or you tell me why it's not getting done this way. And that's just like a very simple example. We're not getting into like actual operational things. But the point here is, how do you get to transform the stress into peaceful, joyous profits? You eliminate the stress at the root, okay? And then you address whatever operational changes need to be made to basically upgrade the container that is your business that's going to hold more freely available time and profit, right? That's essentially what you're pouring into all of this, right? When there are no leaks. So if this is something that resonates with you, if you're like, yeah, I totally get what you're talking about, I want to dive deeper into this, I want to figure out how this is all affecting me, my Peaceful Profits Roadmap is basically a mapping out of all of the identity, leadership, and operational upgrades you need to make in order to get more peaceful profits. And it includes everything I talked about here, full assessment of all of the stress drivers, breaking that down into the profit and time leaks you're experiencing right now, blueprinting how you're going to basically recapture those profit and time leaks and turn them into operational efficiencies that ultimately translate into money you love making through enthusiastic motivation that all drives profits that ultimately fund the ideal life you want to live. So if that's of interest, check out the link either below or around this video and register for that. And I'd love to see you there.